like to suggest that there are a number of conclusions here that ought to challenge how American Jews think about themselves and think about their future. Number one, we do not learn the lessons of 1990. In the aftermath of 1990, the release of the National Jewish Population Study, the famous 52% mixed marriage figure, the mindset inside the Jewish community was that we need to reprioritize the Jewish set of priorities. We need to recalibrate what really counts in Jewish life. There was a great deal of talk about big things, including aid to Jewish education, especially Jewish education. None of that materialized. 2000 came along, Oslo broke down, Camp David broke down, anti-Semitism returned to Europe in ways that none of us predicted. A terror war broke out in Israel, and frankly, it became business as usual inside the Jewish community. Or as one social scientist put it very well, he said what the collapse of Oslo did was it re-securitized the Jewish agenda. It meant, in other words, that security for Israel and Jews would be the critical item on the agenda. Obviously, no one can trivialize that. But the promise of 1990 was that what really ails the Jewish community are the internal issues of what it means to be a Jew and how to enable Jews to lead a Jewish life. Jewish education is obviously at the very core of that Jewish continuity agenda. What needs to be done is to go back, if you will, first and foremost, to the recalibration of priorities that so many of us were optimistic about 25 years ago, but which did not take place, and which Oslo basically made obsolete, or the collapse of Oslo made obsolete. Second, I gave you the Boston and San Francisco federations. I don't mean to jump on them. Obviously, they do a great deal of good, but there's a larger problem that goes beyond the federation world, though it's a particular locality of it. And that is Jewish leadership needs to be challenged on upholding the fundamental Jewish values of endogamy, marriage to Jews, conversion to Judaism, if the spouse is not Jewish. Jews have lived by those twin values for 4,000 years. What's happened on our watch, meaning simply within the last 20 years, 25 years, is that intermarriage has collapsed normatively. Remember, Jews still continue to prefer Jewish spouses, but most of us have come to the point of shrugging our shoulders and saying, okay, if it doesn't happen, we move on. We've allowed this norm, which has sustained Jews for so long, to collapse literally on our watch. Don't think I'm just making this up. I'll give you an extreme example, but I think it speaks volumes. 1994, I was at the General Assembly, it was then known as the Council of Jewish Federations. They had it was then found in Montreal, it was then held in Montreal. They had a panel of 6 major Jewish leaders talking about mixed marriage. One local person from Montreal got up and said, we need new traditions that will enable mixed marriage to celebrate both faiths. Then she went a bit further, said something like a Hanukkah Mass. One of the rabbis in the group then said, well, why don't you go a step further and say, how about a brisening? What bothered me was not that she said it. What bothered me is that you had a panel of 6 leaders. None of them was prepared to get up and say, we're Jewish leaders. The fact that Jews may do this, that happens. But our job as Jewish leaders is to be able to point out what's right and what's wrong. And that's something we can't do. And that's something we can't allow ourselves to be tolerant of. Lest you think that's an isolated example, the next year was in Denver, Colorado. I went to a similar panel. A young lady, 21 years old, got up and said, this has been such an outstanding panel. All my life I've heard about, remember she's 21 years old, all my life I've heard about the importance of marrying someone who's Jewish. Not so easy to find Jewish guys. For the first time I'm hearing it's okay not to marry a Jew. Again, I said she's gotten the wrong message. No one on the panel was prepared to say that. So in that sense, it's a real challenge to Jewish leadership of is it prepared to articulate a language of endogamy? Frankly, again, that's a position that right now is politically incorrect, politically impossible. A very distinguished Jewish criminal professional, headed up a major Jewish education agency for many years, said point blank, there's no reason to encourage a message of endogamy inside Jewish education because it will prove offensive to those who are not in that situation. He's wrong in principle, but he's right in saying what is the reality on the ground. Thirdly, and this brings it back to the discussion earlier about orthodoxy, it's the responsibility of orthodoxy, in my view, to encourage, to, if you will, ensure Jewish continuity within the conservative and reform movements. Now, I'm not suggesting that orthodoxy needs to acknowledge the authenticity of the conservative reform movements. That's a theological question on which we can have endless debates on. But the sociological issue, I think, is very straightforward. Namely, orthodoxy is too small to sustain the Jewish world. In another generation, that may change, but I'm not going to be around for that. Right now, the future of the Jewish community hinges upon what happens inside the conservative reform movements. If those movements fail, the Jewish community, the Jewish people, are irrevocably weakened. In that respect, it behooves Orthodox leadership to spend more time encouraging positive trends within the conservative reform movements and less time criticizing or negating those trends as theological heresy. Or as I had recently a discussion with a leading member of the Rabbinical Council of America who was very upset about Yeshivat Chovevei Torah and various things that were going on there. I wrote to him back, again, this is a very distinguished Jewish intellectual and rabbi, and I said to him, I said, at a time of assimilation, don't you think you should be spending more time worrying about how to combat assimilation? YCT rabbis are capable of reaching people that you can't, and less time worrying about, is there theological heresy within the walls of YCT? He didn't bother responding to the email, by the way, because I think he thought I really had a point, or he certainly had a point that was unarguable, but he could not sign on to it. My point is, if you will, again, very straightforward. It's a challenge to orthodoxy. It's how it will perceive those movements that are either, in this case, on the left-wing fringe of orthodoxy, or in the case of the conservative reform movements, movements that are trying to strengthen Jewish life, but are, if you will, taking too many hits from Orthodox leaders who seem more intent on trying to delegitimize them than they are on trying to reach Jews as Jews and encourage them to lead a creative and intensive Jewish life. That's orthodoxy to the outside world. What about within orthodoxy itself? And here again we come to a painful but I think no less real issue. We discussed it last night at Friday night dinner at the Osifs. There have always been two views towards conversion to Judaism. This goes back to ancient times. And again, I'm not offering you a halakhic analysis. I'm just saying simply the two views have always been there. One view is that of you accept a convert only when that convert accepts 613 mitzvot. The other view has been that of you teach a few major things and a few minor things, and then you let the rest flow in time. In other words, you have a restrictive view of conversion and a much more inclusive view of conversion. Historically, that is indisputable. What is also indisputable is that since the 1840s, the restrictive view has been prevalent. It begins with the Khatam Sofer in the 1840s, primarily because the reform movement was essentially offering that inclusive view. And orthodoxy, under the influence of the Khatam Sofer and his followers, basically moved much more towards the restrictive view. In the late 1970s, Rabbi Soloveitchik of blessed memory took a different position. Now, he did not take it in a scholarly article. He took it in an interview with a newspaper in Hadoar in Israel. And he said point blank, he said, my Orthodox friends will stone me for this. But he said, I think we have to change our position. Our position has been far too restrictive. What we need to do, and here I'm quoting him, he said, we need to do as the Reform do. Namely, make conversion possible on as wide a basis as possible. Now then he qualified it by saying, of course that does not mean we'll abandon halakhic positions. But what it does mean is that instead of saying no and putting up barriers and making it more difficult, we need to be able to make it more accessible, more available. Or as one prominent rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, again he represents what we might call the left wing of orthodoxy, he said to me, assume he doesn't mind being quoted, he said to me, he said, it really is not that hard. Our job should be to facilitate it, to make it possible, rather than to be putting up barriers. Again, this is not the mainstream view of the Rabbinical Council of America, although Rabbi Mark Jirach, the executive director of the Rabbinical Council of America, wrote an article about 3 years ago, in which he also inclined towards the more inclusive view. Obviously, it is not the position of the RCA, and again, as I say, there is dissonance, if you will, between what might be called on-the-ground needs of the community and the practices leading Orthodox rabbis. Fourthly, Jewish philanthropic norms. We spoke again about this briefly at the table. Again, there may be some generational shifts that are taking place, but the amount of Jewish wealth in this country is enormous. However, 20% of it goes to Jewish causes and 80% goes to non-Jewish causes. That's the philanthropic norm. That can be turned around, but only with the Herculean efforts of Jewish leaders to try to make that case. And realize that it's also closely aligned with the issue of assimilation. The higher the level of assimilation, the greater the philanthropy will be to universalist causes. You may have seen an article this week's Jewish Week, the Cummings Foundation, one of those prominent families in Chicago. They set up a foundation a number of years ago, of which a sizable portion of its program would be devoted to Jewish values and culture. They're now changing that and saying their core program will be universalist social concerns. I understand and respect their social concerns. However, I also say in the same breath, there are other foundations and other philanthropists who will be taking care of those social concerns, or who should be challenged to take care of them. The Jewish foundations, those who are Jewishly conscious, ought to be asking themselves, to use the Talmudic phrase, Aniyei Yercha Krovim Me'aniyei another city. The poor of your city take precedence over the poor of another city. In that respect, priorities ought to be Jewish philanthropic norms. I'm not suggesting a reversal, by the way, of go from 80% general philanthropy to 20% Jewish philanthropy, and wow.
Okay, I got it.
I realize that those who disagree with much of what I say